All right, so produce safety, why is this important? And we always talk about the 4 W's. So you have water, waste, wildlife, and workers. And these are pretty much all the inputs that are going to go into the farm. And each of these things are very important. And if you have a breakdown in one, that can really impact the other ones. And so I'm going to kick this off talking a little bit about why we care about produce safety. And the reason is that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention estimate that a lot of people get sick every year from foodborne illness, right? So really it boils down to 1 in 6 of us. I tend to eat riskier foods. I always say it's science-based, but I choose to take that risk. So I probably am sick more often than the average person. But we have 128,000 hospitalization and 3,000 deaths every year. So the economic impact is huge, right? So this actually, let me see, I think I have it here on this next slide. So fresh produce is actually attributed to about almost half of all the foodborne related outbreaks. And this was a change that we've seen over the last 10 years. So I would say a decade prior, most of our outbreaks were associated with animals and animal products. And the reason being is where these pathogens that cause illness, they're naturally found in these animals. So therefore they could be found in the byproducts. Then about 10 years ago, we made this switch. And so no longer was it things like meat and poultry, dairy, eggs. We actually saw fresh produce being one of the highest rates of foodborne illness. So that's kind of how I ended up in this position. If anybody remembers, if you've been in Indiana in 2012, we had the salmonella outbreak associated with fresh cantaloupe. 3 people actually died, and that was a farm, excuse me, originating in southern Indiana. So basically the growers said, we need somebody who's dedicated to fresh fruit and vegetable food safety in the state. And that's how I got this job. And then I have a colleague, his name is Scott Monroe. So I'm located on campus and he's located in the southern part of the state. So between the two of us, we pretty much handle anything food safety related to produce operations. So why so many illnesses? There's lots of things, right? We are buying and consuming more produce because the government tells us to, right? USDA says half our plate should be fruit and vegetables, so we're eating more. And that means then we're getting it from other parts of the country, right? We're importing a lot from Mexico, from South America, from Canada. And so they're coming from all different places, meaning that the distribution is pretty high. We're also getting better at finding these pathogens and detecting them, right? So, we probably were missing, not saying there was this huge dramatic shift 10 years ago, but we might have, that all of a sudden produce is contaminated. I don't think that is the case. I think we're eating more and we're better at detecting it, all right? So again, that all of this attributes to the increase in illnesses. So microbial causes of illness, typically what we see the most common is bacteria. So these are things like Salmonella, Listeria monocytogenes, E. coli 157H7. So that's the most common. But we also see parasites. So things like Giardia, Cryptosporidium, they can cause illness. And then also viruses. So norovirus, hepatitis, things like that. But typically most of what we cover when we think about good ag practices are bacteria. So we already talked about the big 3, always describe them as, so Salmonella, E. coli, Listeria monocytogenes. And so these are the 3 most common bacteria that cause illness. But of course, there's others that pop up, but most of the time it's one of these guys. And the problem, why we care about bacteria the most, is because it doesn't take a long time for these things to reproduce. And they can reproduce easily in the environment as well as inside of our body. And so you can go from one cell and you have it 24 hours under ideal growing conditions. Now we have millions of cells, right? So typically one cell is not going to make us sick, but certainly millions of cells will. And so this can happen very quickly, especially given the right growing conditions. And so where do we find these bacteria? Everywhere on the farm, right? And that's what I always teach. We can't prevent bacteria from being on the farm. There's absolutely no way to do that. So all we're doing, we're assessing risk and we're managing those risks, right? That's all we can do. So when people say, well, I want to make sure I get rid of everything, we can't. So don't try. It's not going to happen. These bacteria are just everywhere naturally, right? So we just have to identify possible risks and we have to manage those risks as best as we can. And this is a question we get all the time too. So if I wash my produce, does that guarantee it's safe? And the answer is no. So does washing help? Absolutely. And is it recommended that you as a consumer wash your produce? Absolutely. But just know that, especially given if it's a high level of contamination, that you're not going to remove everything, right? You're just not. That's the way it is. So definitely as consumers, we're washing that product, but growers, you need to make that decision whether it's something you want to do on your farm or not. So there's nothing saying you have to wash your produce unless your buyer requires it. So if your buyer says, I want you to wash that cantaloupe before I buy it, well, if you want to sell into that market, then that's what you have to do. But so say you're selling at a farmer's market, maybe you don't need to, or maybe your buyers, whoever's buying at the farmer's market, they don't care. They plan on washing it at home. So great, that they can do that as well. So again, it's that decision is up to the grower. And here's just a picture too, just showing. So this is a surface of a lettuce leaf. I was like putting this one in here, but these are E. coli bacteria, and these are that hole there is a place for gas exchange on the surface of a leaf, and you can see how these bacteria can get in there. And then if this closes, they can actually be inside that leaf. And if that's the case, then washing certainly is not going to help, right? Because it's internalized. So the other issue with produce is most of the time we're eating it fresh, right? And so it's not processed. And so the only way that we're going to guarantee that we get rid of that bacteria that's on the surface of produce or internalized would be to cook it, right? And so think about all the things that we eat that we don't cook, right? We're not probably cooking lettuce. There's how many times we eat fresh tomatoes or cantaloupe, we're probably not cooking, right? So we don't have that kill step. So that's why doing all these good agricultural practices that we're going to talk about over the next couple of sessions are so important, because it's really hard to clean it up after the fact. It's a lot easier to try to prevent that contamination from happening in the first place. And that's what good ag practices are all about. So trying to prevent contamination. So where can produce be contaminated? Pretty much anywhere, right? So it could happen in the field, maybe during washing or packing, maybe during cooling or storing, maybe during transportation when you're bringing things to the market, or maybe even at the market themselves, right? So just think of how many people touch fresh produce, and I have all these natural bacteria on my hands, so does everybody else. And every time somebody's touching it, we're just adding more and more bacteria to those products. So, right, it can be contaminated anywhere. So we want to just keep all of these different places in our minds to identify any risks of contamination that could be present. So, right, we talked about this, good ag practices are conditions or the growing practices or harvesting practices that minimize the risk of contamination. So we can't prevent everything, There's just no way, like I said. I mean, and there's bacteria always there. So we're just trying to minimize that risk that our fruits and vegetables that we grow, harvest, pack, hold, transport, sell, is the likelihood of contamination is minimized as much as possible. So the benefits of following these good ag practices, right, are all these things. Of course, public health, we don't want to, I mean, nobody wants to put adulterated food into commerce, right? But so we can improve public health. I would always talk about extending the shelf life too, right? So yes, we are concerned about human pathogenic bacteria, absolutely. But number two is that shelf life. So that's how long that produce is good for you to be able to sell it or to somebody to buy it from you, right? So when I first graduated, I worked with Dole Fresh Vegetables for about 5 years on the fresh bag salad line. And so absolutely Dole's number one was they did not want to get anybody sick, of course, but a very, very, very close second was shelf life. Because if they could get one extra day out of that bag of salad, that meant one extra day that somebody could buy it and it wasn't being thrown away. So as you're following these good ag practices, you're reducing the likelihood of transmission of obviously pathogenic bacteria that make us sick, but you're also reducing the likelihood that these spoilage microorganisms are around, right? So again, it's a good thing. It's kind of a win-win by following these practices. So steps for food safety on the produce farm, well, first is doing some sort of GAPS training like this one, right? Then, like I talk about the risks, so you want to do some sort of farm self-assessment. So every farm is different, and every farm is going to do stuff slightly differently, right? So you're going to have things that are different, and hopefully then after we do this training, there could be practices that you say, I probably shouldn't do it like that. I could be introducing a risk, right? And so maybe if we can, we try to modify that practice. And then writing out these food safety plans. This is not required, but basically all this is putting into words what you're actually doing on the farm. So it's writing these standard operating procedures for everything that you're doing, right? And again, this isn't required, but it's a good way to help people get organized and decide, where you're going to, you only have limited time, you have limited money. So where do you put those resources? So everybody should be concerned about food safety. I mean, because we're all in this together. And that's what we've learned. It doesn't matter the size of the farm. It doesn't matter what the product is. If spinach from X farm gets somebody sick, guess what? People don't want to eat any spinach. It's not just spinach from farm X. It's spinach in general, right? So everybody loses out. And I remember, whatever was that, 2-3 years ago with the romaine, where the romaine lettuce outbreak, and they couldn't figure out where it was coming from. And I had growers in Indiana who were growing lettuce indoors, and they couldn't sell their lettuce. So there was no way that lettuce came from them, but nobody was buying it. So they just said nobody is buying romaine lettuce, right? So that impacted the entire industry, and it really came back to one farm, right? So we're all in this together.